many of you touched upon, part of the reason that you're taking the course is the world we live in, prompting you to think again about war and what you should be thinking and why are humans violent, etc. Again, I think that speaks to a kind of natural traction that great literature from very different time periods and different cultures presents to us. So I hope everyone benefits in some way from that. So the nature of our course together, I think those of you who've taken courses with AMI know that it's Catholic. It places itself within the Catholic intellectual tradition. That is one of its unique features. I know of no other Catholic great books, online, synchronous conversation educational program out there. It's synchronous, which is very different. Any of you who've studied online, very different experience to have your conversations live and have a kind of community to get to know and to bounce ideas with in real time. The degree I did in wildlife science and the degree I'm currently doing in military history, I never have this opportunity. Everything is mediated through discussion posts and other things that can work, but it's just not, this is already nicer than all the graduate work that I did online, just to be able to see people, hear the sound of a voice combined with their thoughts. So I think it's wonderful. Since it is a Catholic organization in its founding under the patronage of Albert the Great, what does that mean for us, or at least what do I understand by that? I understand that to mean that our rationality and our benefits from revelation or the Catholic tradition are all allowed to come into play. Because it's above the university level, it also means that we're mature about that. We don't have to be fearful when we get to Augustine or Thomas Aquinas to wrestle the question with those. Faith is important. Reason is important. We want to have very open conversations about all the texts we're reading. But it sounds like most of the people participating are Christians, if not Catholic. And so I certainly will speak freely about religion and the subject of war, my faith in the subject of war. I hope everyone is comfortable with that. It's a program embedded in the liberal arts tradition. It's always worth stopping and asking what words mean. And liberal arts means many things, but an important thing to keep in mind is the liberal part refers to the freeing element of religion or education guided by a conviction that there is truth. Doesn't make it easy to get it, but we're not, even though I'm going to, at times, I guarantee I'm going to sound like I'm a cultural relativist at times because my training is in history. And so I take the distinctions in history very seriously. That doesn't mean that I don't think there's some undergirding truth, and there are lots of universal truths for us to be looking at, weighing when we move through these texts. The art part, I think some of you have gone to institutions where they have a more traditional understanding of the liberal arts, and so you break those down and what those arts were, and the AMI curriculum spells that out pretty well. But also remember that what we're involved in is the art of being a human who can flourish. So some of the art is directed, a lot of the art is directed to us. What are the arts of being a free human who can flourish and be happy? And so as I say to my students, really, I just want everyone in the course to be happy. And I just believe that your happiness comes from doggedly pursuing the truth and testing your ideas with friends and reading great works. So as a Catholic, traditional liberal arts institution, some ground rules. We want to be charitable. We want to be civil in our conversations with one another. I'm going to ask upon a considerable degree of patience from you because I don't really understand. I mean, Larissa already knows. I, on a daily basis, ask her, do I go through groups or do I go through some? I'm baffled by the online. So I would ask your patience as we're talking. This isn't all of us sitting in the room. And so there's always this strange lag as someone unmutes and tries to say something. So try to pay attention to the visual cues and don't let yourself get upset if you thought I've got a brilliant thing, but someone comes in first. Let's just exercise maximal charity and patience towards one another and try to do our best having a conversation mediated through Planet Zoom. Yeah, I think that's sufficient for the ground rules. Now, everyone has some interest in studying war. I want to focus on our attention on just a few things that should run through the whole of this course. Um, why would we study war, and what is it that we're even studying when we say we're studying war? Um, as we move through, we'll see something interesting happening amongst humans is that they continue to try to understand what it is. What exactly is war? If you read through the Iliad, it's not a concern of Homer. Homer doesn't define what war is. Neither does Simone Weil. But by the end of this course, when we get to Clausewitz, it's going to become very important to try to define what war is. It's just worth thinking, what's the advantage of defining something? From the point of view of learning or studying or writing about or assessing, to what degree do you actually have a sense of what war is? If you had to define it right now, what would you say? Are you attracted to formal war studies? Are you attracted to the psychology of conflict? What is it that you're pursuing when you're thinking we're studying war? And it can be defined in a number of ways, and we're going to try to keep it pretty broad. What I'm going after is looking at the causes, trying to make something that is often irrational rational. What are the reasons? I'll put it this way. What are the reasons for the failure to maintain peace? What are the causes of the pretty regular disruptions in what St. Augustine would call the tranquility of order? Why does that happen? And how does it affect the individual, a family, a small community, a kingdom, nation states? So we'll look at a variety of things, but I don't want to let go of trying to seek out the causes for the thing and what the thing disrupts or even destroys when it occurs. As I said, I'm a historian, so I looking at things from a cultural point of view. So we'll be asking, or we can ask, how do the cultures that we move through differ? Today's very much set up as an orientation, right? We have one foundational work, Homer, bedrock of Western civilization, one modern work. But then next week, we start moving historically through the Greeks, then Romans, then early Christians and medievals, and we're marching up to the modern period. And I would encourage you to try to be attentive to the things that develop, the things that are perennial. So the difference between development and perennial, in my view, would be the perennial things are going to be there anyway. The development is a conscious working out of an idea. And the things that are different, we should notice that there are occasionally things that are just different in how cultures view organized violent conflict. One possible simple definition of war. We will give some time when it's appropriate to particulars. So those of you who do like talking about weapons and strategy and tactics, those can all play into and should play into assessing conflict, because technology is never neutral. Technology can shape actions and can reduce human freedom as much as it can extend human power and at times enhance human freedom. And I hope, I suspect it's already going on in your mind, but I hope the course is constantly raising large questions for you about how you advise. Many of you involved in education, all of you have a network of friends. Can war, in fact, be avoided? How do we assess? I mean, it's true. I have been thinking more and more and more with the conflict in Israel, how to assess that as a Christian. I find both sides have very strong positions, and there's very little rationality in the way the public discussion about war there or in Ukraine is going on. War seems to have moved very much back into the front of daily awareness and considerations in a way that for most of my life it hasn't been. When I was a little boy, my father is a Vietnam veteran. The echoes of Vietnam lingered for a long time. One of my earliest memories is sitting with my father. I was probably, I would have been, I think, 7 years old, watching the fall of Saigon on television, seated in front of the TV with a TV dinner, eating dinner with a Marine Corps officer. My father was at Khe Sanh, for those of you Marines or military, watching the fall of Saigon. So at an early age, very much part of my sense of what's going on in politics and public conversation. But then it sort of faded out with punctuated wars. Now it seems very much front and center again. And there are some perennial questions that we'll want to ask. Is war always to be avoided? I hope it's not too controversial to say this. I think we have to admit it, but there are many wise people, smart people at least, if not wise, who have said there's a certain good socially in war, that it purifies people, individuals, and a people of certain bad tendencies or bad aspects. We should just take that seriously. Wow, is there time? Are there times where we can say warfare is, in a way, socially good? Is it possible to say that? Can you fight a war in a way that you are good as you fight it? Catholic tradition, the Christian tradition says there are certain conditions under which that can happen. What kind of language do we use to describe that? How do we think of ourselves when we watch a war movie and we're thrilled, or we read Homer and we're really moved and excited by it? But if we pull aside and think about what's depicted or what's being described, we might want to be more sober and circumspect, even sad, like perhaps reading the Simone Weil essay left you. That's the destruction of dignified human life that's occurring. How are we to approach that? How are we to think about that? So just some opening backdrop issues before we jump in. So the text that you had today, book 22 of the Iliad, and Simone Weil's essay that was published after her death about the Iliad. I hope that you had a opportunity to read these texts. So one general question, some of you didn't have a chance to read, at least read all of Simone Weil. One of the reasons why I put the Iliad and Simone Weil together is just to get us into the practice of recognizing interpretation and recognizing that intelligent, thoughtful people can have interpretations that we absolutely disagree with or partially disagree with. So I'm happy to show some of my cards right now. I love that Simone Weil essay. I find it's moving if you know a little bit about when she's writing it and her, but I think it goes so far, and I think Simone Weil misses some things in her interpretation of the Iliad. So one of the reasons I give it is just to take us through the exercise of reading things that are really can be beautiful and insightful, but not entirely. Now you may be utterly convinced by her argument. We can talk about, for those of you who read it, we can talk about that later. But I hope those of you who did read it, it made you think, is that right? Is that how I read it? Or, So I will occasionally throw in something that's more contemporary to us. I'll try always to pick a classic, noble piece of criticism if we do that, but I'll occasionally try to throw that in. So book 22, there's a lot that we could talk about. Maybe if we could go big picture for a moment, and I rather stop talking for a minute. So someone who has read the Iliad recently or a number of you in the commentary read it at some point. So someone has a rough sense of the Iliad as a whole. What's going on in book 22 with respect to the trajectory of the whole story? And does it offer any kind of significance to the whole story? Clearly, I'm a wise and experienced teacher. I would only pick things that are deeply significant. So I must have picked 22 for some good reason. If anyone has read 22, how does it configure into the whole story, would you say? And this could be helpful for those who are a little rusty.
Um,
Go ahead.
yeah, I'm also a little bit rusty, but I do remember this part pretty specifically. It's when Achilles kills Hector and drags his body around Troy.
Mhm.
That's the short answer.
Okay, so yeah, summary of book 22. Achilles finally gets Hector, and it's over for the hero that everyone loves, but in my view, they shouldn't love too much. Hector, he's not the hero, and Achilles moves forward in his towards his destiny. So this is the death of Hector. Sometimes book 22 is just called the death of Hector. Achilles finally gets him. How about now? Can anyone move out though? This is what I'm interested in. Can anyone can place book 22 in the 24 books of the Iliad, not narrating every book, but just story arc? What is this moment?
I'll take a bad stab at it, Professor. Um, it's like this acerbic cycle of the same SOS all over again, where, when you read just book 22 by itself, it seems like poor Hector, this poor guy, he has a mom and a dad and a family, but Hector laid waste to a lot of moms, dads, sons, daughters, all that other stuff. So it was, and particularly reading the commentary that you assigned along with it, it just, that's the way war is. I found it interesting in Weil's commentary with it. It was like F equals ma, and force is like this thing that pervades across it, which I don't know. I gotta be honest, I'm struggling with it. I don't know if I agree with it or not, but it was it's war. War is cyclical. This is the way war goes. War has been with man since the dawn of time, and war is, whoever is the hero becomes the victim, and the vengeance is then rained on the last victim, and it just keeps going on and on and on. That's the way the Iliad always rang to me. It was nothing happy or sad. It was almost like this. This is the human nature, and this is the way it goes. It's cyclical, and it's sort of a somber tone to it. There's nothing really. It's not like reading the Gospels where there's an uplifting end to it. It's like humanity is broken, and it will be broken, and we are condemned to be broken.
Yeah, and just to jump off from that to add a little more detail, I remember he's avenging his childhood friend Patroclus by killing Hector. And it's just like Scott had said, it was a perpetuating the cycle of violence. Yeah.
So within this whole piece, we have the culmination of the actions of the war. First, it was the initial part was a lot to do with Achilles and his inaction, and then he is driven to action by the death of his friend Patroclus, and which Hector instigates. And now this is him getting the final act of revenge against Hector for killing Patroclus. But this is not the end, as we know. There are two more chapters ahead of us, and those two chapters are him mourning Patroclus, and then his returning of Hector's body to his father Priam. And so this is in a sense, this is the culminate. This is not the climax. The climax was when Achilles, I believe. I don't know if we could call this the climax, because the main action I think has already happened with Achilles. With Patroclus' death and Achilles rising up, this could be an extended part of the climax, or the more, I would say, the turning point where Achilles is now changing from getting his revenge to mourning Patroclus, which is a change of his own of his character, as we see in the end. We even see at the end of this where instead of letting the other Achaeans stab the corpse of Hector, he's just like, lay off of it. We need to go bury Patroclus now. Which I think was the most interesting things that struck me when reading this chapter, the last part.
So, building a little bit off of what Owen said, I don't disagree with any of the observations. Scott, in particular, I think is seeing the Iliad as a kind of window into some perennial things about the nature of war, perhaps, and the sadness that surrounds it. But usually, stories have some kind of tension in them. There's a story arc. There's some sort of problem or tension that's going to get tighter and tighter and tighter and holds the audience captivated, and then it's loosened at the end. For those of you who remember, add in or correct me if I'm wrong, but if you let's think back for a moment. I mean, Owen said something very interesting about the character of Achilles, who is the central character. Not the only character. It's a very complex, it's an epic, so there are loads of people, but he is, at least the Greeks understood their own poem as this is a poem principally about Achilles, but it's unusual for something that Owen said. Achilles has been struggling for portions of this play with whether he should do anything. He's in a bad mood that makes many people, when they first read the Iliad, I think, not like him. It's not very interesting to have the hero pouting on the beach all the time because he's all torn up about his destiny and more fundamentally over his honor. But the opening of the book, sets the tone of this. This is going to be a story about wrath and incredible violence and the effects of rage or wrath, right? Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus's son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses. The Achaeans, meaning his own side, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion, feast for the dogs and birds. And the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. Began Muse when the two first broke and clashed. Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. It's interesting that Troy is the place of conflict in the opening of that poem, but it's not the conflict between two nations, two opposing people. The conflict that's underscored there is the sort of internal conflicts amongst the Greeks themselves. And in the first several books, we have this great insult, as Achilles perceives it, to his honor by having his girlfriend taken away by the Greek warlord, which forces him to think, I'm out. I've been dishonored publicly. I'm out. And then you have fight going on, all kinds of tension over that. And eventually, when his best friend is killed wearing his armor, he comes back in. But it takes quite some time to do that. What follows? I think this is important, and this is something that Simone Weil doesn't talk at all. Does anyone remember what follows this book? I think it was Owen or maybe it was Kayla, I can't remember, who said that this book was a kind of climax of the story. Depends on what we mean by that. Maybe in a way. I always find that notion of a climax, you sort of get to almost the end and then you're done. Well, what about the rest of the book? Is it boring? And many people answer in the affirmative on that, because book 22 is where the action seems to come to its climax. What happens in the two subsequent books? Owen alluded to that. Does anyone else remember what in particular The next book, book 23, I didn't assign it, but can anyone fill us in quickly on what's in 23, what's in 24, the actual final books? Does anyone remember? That's fine. Even if you read the Iliad, most people don't remember book 23. It's viewed as the dullest book in the Iliad. Now, in my view, it may be the most important book, and a book that's based on some of the things Scott said, you might find really interesting, right? If you read this book and it's just utterly gloomy and men are fated to die because that's the nature of war and there's no way to get out of that cycle, book 23 questions that a little bit. And let me try to explain some of the architecture of the Iliad. In the world of the Iliad, the hero's value when this book opens up is based on, it's predicated on some very specific things. Girls, loot, principally. And there's a kind of mathematics involved that when a lawyer is or not lawyer, sorry, lawyers, when a warrior is successful in getting those things, sacking cities, winning a fight, and getting material things and humans, then his glory is greater. It's enhanced. The only thing that would make it even greater would be if you have divine blood, as most of the Greek heroes have some divine blood in you. But as far as the warrior culture, it's almost mathematical in its materialism. The more you, and it's true of the Greek city-states as well, the more you have horses, urns, pots, it's very material. Slaves, women, the greater your glory, your kleros. And therefore, and this is the key of the opening and the end, if I as a Greek can take from you some of your slaves, your girlfriend, a pot, then your glory diminishes. It's absolutely mathematical. It's contrary to the way we think, but it's not contrary to the world of the Iliad. You lose stuff, you're simply not as great a man at the beginning of this book. What happens in the book after the one you read are the funeral games that Achilles arranges for his dead friend. And something bizarre happens in those games that most people don't notice. All the way up to this point, if you lose, you're a loser and people laugh at you. And there's no room for mercy, patience, a sense of your humanity, a sense of failure is an acceptable part of life. We all fail at times. You lose, you diminish. You win, you gain. And losers are to be mocked and treated without mercy. But in book 23, all these games are set up. Now remember, the whole poem has been based on if you win an urn from someone, you take armor from someone, it's a sign of your greatness. Throughout these games, there's misfortune that happens to some of the competitors, where someone who's doing extremely well, all of a sudden, spoke on a wheel will go out, something will foul up their finish, and they don't win. And throughout the games, Achilles makes a point of giving something to them and signifies to the Greeks, there's a kind of dignity to this person. It's totally contrary to the previous 22 books, where it was mathematical and a correspondence between failure and taking stuff away. Achilles reverses that in the process of trying to honor his friends through these funeral games. Then the last book is the father of Hector coming to beg the body. And there's a very, even Simone Weil recognizes this recognition of humanity between the two enemies at this moment. So there's a resolution. So in a way, the combat part has a resolution in book 22, but Homer's story and, as it were, his commentary on humanity in the face of fate, human dignity in the face of violence, how we weigh success and failure. That in the last 2, 3 books is radically different than the previous books. And in my view, you don't see much of what Homer seems to be communicating until you get to the Gospels. So Scott was sort of intimating this brutal ancient world is worth our studying in a way. You didn't say it this way, but it's worth our studying in a way because then you see the kind of radicalism of Christianity, and I think that's absolutely true. But I do think every now and then, with a truly great pagan, it's almost as if they have, for just a moment, they have a vision of the world being different, and then it submerges again in kind of sorrow. But there's a vision that it should be different. And so, you know, if you haven't read the Iliad, make sure that you don't give up after book 22, and that you give some serious attention to those last 2 books, because that it's very rich. I'm going to throw it over to all of you for a little bit. If you've got some things that you think we should talk about with these texts, or you have particular things that you don't understand about them, we can collectively try to work through them.
Professor, I was going to take off on something you'd asked or commented on right before the break. When you get into chapter 23, that subtlety that you mentioned around some of the finer points that were not so focused on the failed nature of humans. Is it a stylistic thing with the classic writers, the Greek writers? When you go back to some of the previous chapters, like when you've got Hector on his knees begging for his life and Achilles saying, you're dishonoring yourself, it's disgusting that you're even doing this. I'm sort of paraphrasing. My death is going to come, and you're doing yourself dishonor by doing this. That's so in your face, like, and that's pervasive throughout the text, where they kind of highlight the honor of the warrior and the way they behave and the way you should behave. The other points, which I really never gave much thought about, they're much more subtle. Is that a stylistic thing? Are they meant to be buried in the text, or is it their subtlety that makes them so powerful? I really never thought about it, to be honest.
Well, first of all, by subtle, do you mean that in the last 2 books there's this movement away and calling into question a lot of the, quote, as you put it, the in your face behavior? I mean, that's kind of a very famous moment when Achilles says, hey, if you want to look at beauty and glory and awesomeness, you're looking at it, and I know I'm doomed, so just stop whining. You're going to die. You know? And then by the next book, there's I wouldn't say it's a different man, but there's this kind of growth, which is not that it's latent in the other books. But by subtle, do you mean is that what you mean? That it shows up at the end, but it's not really strong?
I think it is, and I'm not trying to show my biases, so to speak, like, because when I read the Iliad years, like 30 years ago, I'm trying to refer back, like when you started going through, I'm like, oh yeah. Now I'm starting to remember some of the things that I forgot about. What I found as a kid, and even just reflecting on it, was it didn't seem so not in my face, like the fraternal love between military men. And this might be my bias coming through. Like, nobody joins the Marine Corps to go fight in wars because of anything political. You're trying to keep the guy to the left and the right alive, and you're hoping that they're doing the same thing for you. That's literally it. It's about that simple. It's not about whatever got you there or why you're there. Those questions almost never come up until it starts getting old. Those things, even in the Iliad, seemed like Achilles, like he was, some of the vengeful acts he took were out of fraternal love for his comrades and things like that. So to me, that always appeared to be in my kind of just as in your face. I don't know if it came across that way to others, Whereas the other parts where there's sort of the mourning, um, the sort of the flaws of humanity that don't allow you to see these things earlier, to kind of avoid some of the things. Like those things came across, but it was almost, the way I read it, it was almost like an afterthought or a lament, like not that's what I guess I mean by subtle. They didn't seem as, dominant as the other themes.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't dispute that the previous 21, 22 books are very consistent, and then you get to 23 and 24 and there's a big shift. I just think that that's the way Homer has structured it. Why? I could offer a couple possibilities. One is the origins of this poem. It does stem from a long oral tradition of probably a number of prior poets who are earning their bread and butter by going from town to town, singing this story over the course of probably 2 or 3 weeks, maybe even longer. The organization of the books has always been thought to be that's an evening's recitation. And so 24 books, I mean, this is a good month of pay on the part of the poet. If you're a poet in a heroic society, everyone says that's the origin of the poem. I don't think you want to come out on day one with, hey, how about mercy? For a couple reasons. One is, one's not that noble, but it's very human. Poets and singers, they need wine and bread and meat too, and they want a month's worth of labor, not 2 days. From the artistic point of view, it's a terrible way to do the story, right? I mean, take your pick of any great story that ends with some kind of dramatic resolution. Imagine you knew that up front. It'd just be terrible. So artistically, it makes no sense to ever do a story that way. But also, and I'm inclined to add this is more sort of personal interpretation. If you are a thoughtful person and you realize that there's certain powerful aspects of the human condition, you're not a Christian, you're a 9th century, 8th century BC pagan. Part of it is we're just doomed. We're fated towards a certain end. And our freedom exemplifies itself in a kind of nobility of action under this tremendous, kind of gloomy pressure. And you witness the endless cycle of violence and the endless injustice of seeing a disconnect between who are the wealthy people, how did they gain that wealth? Who are good people that you've seen or know about? They just die brutal lives ended short. If these things are on your mind and you're constructing a story based on a historic war where you have a vision, and I do think it's almost like a poetic vision that if you're thinking about issues of justice, you're doing that rightly, just with your mind, you're going to realize that the cycle of violence has to somehow have a resolution. It can't just be what the pagans are stuck with, doom and fate. Reason alone in the mind of a sensitive person will give them a glimpse of something different. Now, if you walk with me a little bit with that possibility as what's going on in the poetic, and you look at the poem in Greek, and this is a pitch for Larissa talking to John so that I get a whole course on the Iliad out of this, because I would love to march through very slowly. But if you look at what happens in the language, for 22 books, you have certain words that are emphatically used. And two of the words that are emphatically used the most are rage and madness. And those kind of reach a crescendo, and then they start going down for the last couple books, and they're replaced by mercy. Mercy sort of wipes out rage at the end of the book. And what's strange is it's mercy not like what's expressed in the earlier books. Occasionally you have someone grabbing the knees. That's what you do when you're if you ever get in a fight with an 8th century Greek warrior, grab his knees, because that's the position that you have to occupy if you have any chance of getting out of it. And you beg for mercy, right? And he begged for mercy from, that's how mercy is used in the early books. In the last two books, it's reversed. Mercy comes from Achilles and it's directed towards other people. They don't ask for it. He views a human situation and he has mercy on them. All the books up to that, my favorite prayer outside of Catholic prayers is in, I think, book 17, when I can't remember who it is. They're in the middle of the fight, and the Nicaeans are just shrouded in mist. They can't see anything. It's the fight to recover the body of Patroclus. It's just a great, like, no man down moment where we're going to get his body out of here. And it's just carnage everywhere. But then this gloom comes in, and it turns into absolute misery for the Achaeans. And the prayer to Zeus is, lift the mist and let us at least die in the light of day, since killing us is your desire. That's the prayer. And Homer says at that moment, and it's one of the only moments when this is said of Zeus, Zeus was moved with pity. And that's a kind of inkling of what's going to happen at the end, when there's no plea that is saying, I need mercy in this kind of way that gets in your face. Achilles, there's some of that with Priam obviously approaching him, but Achilles first sees people screwing up in these competitive events, and then he sees Priam, and he's just merciful at witnessing broken humanity. And then the poem ends right back where you said, Scott. It ends with, we're not in the Christian world. We don't have the full answer. It is just, and so ends the story of Hector, breaker of horses. I mean, it's just, we're right back to bury the hero, the war goes on. But there's a glimmer, and I don't think it's subtle or hidden. I do think it's Homer's intention of, he's building up this grinding action, all this violence that ends with no violence. In the same way that the Odyssey grinds and moves in a certain ending, and then there's a kind of strange resolution towards the end of that too. That's what I mean.
Thank you. That was great.
Those of you who read Simone Weil, what are you, any thoughts? Anything that, without being, well, it's not a text where you have to worry about a spoiler alert, right? I mean, she sets out in the first paragraph, really, with the rest of the text is just backing up her thesis with passages from Homer on her central point. The Iliad, I mean, the title, Iliad, right? Or the poem of force. And any thoughts?
I would
there?
Yes. I got tripped up in the second paragraph and I never got over it.
Okay.
When she said, force is that X that turns anybody who is subjected to it into a thing.
Mm-hmm.
But aren't there any number of things other than force that can reify a person?
Walk us through that. What are we give us? I mean, I'm inclined to just say yes. Next question, but what would you insert in there?
Okay, on a very basic level, if you ignore a person who deserves your attention, you are making a thing of them. You are not treating them like a person. So it seems to me that in the myriad of ways that humans can dehumanize one another, force is not the most common one.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I mean, it could be insult, it can be speech, it can be, well, I mean, any of you can give examples of that, but I just kind of got stuck there and I didn't know exactly what she meant.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think my guess is she would say, yeah, I agree with that too. I'm not trying to say that force is the only thing that reduces people. I think any evil action treats people as objects. I mean, and take your pick of your favorite moral evil. It reduces everyone's humanity to an object of what I get to manipulate or use. I think
But
she's
this is
trying to
the-
put,
This is the problem that I have with it. That's her definition. So if that's her definition, it's not a definition.
Yeah. Okay, do you mind if I springboard off of that a little bit?
sure.
The thing that I was really about to stop reading it because I was starting to take somewhat of offense to it when she got to the part that a warrior is reduced to a soulless. I forget exactly what it was, but it was offensive to me personally. But then when I got to the end of it, then I just got confused because it seemed like she reversed course on a lot of what she was saying. But the beginning where I had the same exact problem where it's this idea of force, that there's no willing component of a warrior. There's no, everything was reduced to, there's this massive force. And in this particular article, it didn't get to whether it was intrinsic or extrinsic force, where it came from. You're like part of this wave that's moving and nothing can stop it. And it ultimately results into people that wage war are things, and that their souls are essentially completely jeopardized. But then as she got towards the end of it, it seemed like that's where I got confused. She seemed to kind of redeem herself in the way she was describing it. And I'll just be perfectly honest, I was like, this is somebody that's never been within 500 miles of the front line. They've been sitting at the back end of a war, watching it and trying to guess what it's about. So I had the same exact problem with it, but I did land in a place where I thought she had a deeper insight to things than I originally thought, but I still haven't fully, I'll be perfectly honest, I finished reading it about half an hour before class started. So I didn't get a chance to fully digest it.
Scott, if it makes you feel better, or give her a little bit more authority to say these things about warriors, she fought in the Spanish Civil War, and she volunteered for one of the most dangerous commando units. She was terrible by all accounts in pursuing her duties because her vision was so bad, but she was determined to take on very dangerous jobs in combat, and did so until finally her commanding officer said, no one doubts your bravery and your willingness to be where almost no one else is willing to be, but you're a liability to the team. And so she was sent back. But she actually did serve in the Spanish Civil War, so she has a lot more experience that right now, as I said, I'm doing a military history course, and I'm with a lot of people who are military, none of whom who have combat experience, and they have a tendency to talk a very, very big talk about war. One thing I learned from my father was some people command desks, and they have a tendency to talk a tremendous amount about war. And often people who see the worst combat tend to be more circumspect and talk more about how to mitigate violence, even though they're pretty sober about the likelihood of that ever changing.
I don't want to monopolize the conversation by any means, and anyone can tell me to shut up at any time and you won't hurt my feelings. But I did a quick Google search and I read that about her, and it seemed like she was a very passionate person, but I would put that akin to a draftee versus an enlistee. Like when you're well-meaning and dive into a war because you care so much about it, but you're not entrenched in the this or that of warfare, and you're willing to take on a lot of dangerous things, and you don't even really know what you're signing up for. Just like when someone's drafted and thrown into a war they don't want to be in. That again, this is my thumbnail 30-second digesting of
Sure.
trying to be prepared for class, so I might be entirely off base. There's plenty of people that were drafted that won medals of honor and pale in comparison to those of us that did it willingly. And similarly, there are people that run headlong into battle that probably have no business being there.
I think that was, frankly, I think that was the case. Well, I know that was the case with Simone Weil. I just wanted to say she's not a Parisian academic sitting safely in Paris writing an essay. She actually has some grit to her. Personally, since we're, 20 minutes from the end, I think Simone Weil's writings are interesting. I disagree with her interpretation of Homer. As a person, she's passionate. She's passionate and she's thoughtful. She's also a little bit crazy.
Yeah, I don't know enough about her, but it was I just want to make sure I made my point clear.
Yeah.
It kind of
yeah.
won me over at the end. I was starting to read some of the things. I don't know if I agreed with her entirely, but I was glad that I read all the way through, and it was it gave me a lot to think about, which is exactly what I'm trying to get out of this class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I take the point that there are many things that could reduce a human. I think she's simply trying to, I think in her own mind, she's trying to be honest in her interpretation of the Iliad. But I also think you need to look at the date of the essay and just accept this is part of our own enhancing our own abilities as readers. It's awfully good to know a little bit about the context and the writer. She's deeply invested in doing what she can in the war effort against Germany. She's living in exile. She's doing crazy things like living on a starvation diet because that's what people in camps or in difficult situations are doing. But on her mind all the time is the thing that I think many sensitive people were thinking about in the mid-40s. How can a cultured, civilized people be so destructive? And she chooses to take on a foundational text as, in her view, being a masterwork for revealing the nature of violence as she sees it. I think it's telling that she leaves out the last two books, which offers, I think, Homer's own views on how things resolve. Maybe, Scott, one of the reasons why you began to like her is that that's the only point where she begins to admit, well, it's not always as brutal as I've depicted. But yeah, but back to the Sherry's point. Yep, there are other things that can reduce humans, but her framing device for interpreting the Iliad is an interesting, I don't want to say mistake, I don't know how to put it, but I wouldn't say the poem is about force, but it's an interesting take, and she tries to explain what she means. By force, I mean that fatal power out there that reduces, I mean, that's why she just calls it X, because what is it? That reduces those humans who sort of embrace it, it reduces them, and they're engaged in reducing others into a thing. And sure, there are other forces or there are other evils that do that, but she's concentrating on physical violence in the context of warfare. So,
Can I jump in?
please.
Yeah, thank you for that context about like when she's writing this essay, because I thought it was a beautiful treatise on like, the nature of violence and like what it does to other human beings. But I thought it also didn't really have a whole lot to do with the Iliad as a text, especially that like this book. Because like, I was doing some highlighting when I was reading it, and I thought that there was a really interesting like recurring motif between like, or there was a really interesting recurring motif of like either spiritual degradation, like reducing a human to an animal, or spiritual transcendence, like elevating a human to a god through battle. And it depends on which side of the battle the person is in that, that dictates which side of the spiritual transformation that they're on. And up until the actual murder is committed, then it's, no, I lost my train of thought. Up until the actual murder is committed, like there's kind of a back and forth tete-a-tete between like Achilles and Hector about like who's more of an animal, who is the predator, who's the prey, who is being guided by the gods or protected by the gods, and who is being targeted by them. And then only when Hector's killed is he reduced to an object. And I thought that it was like, I don't know, I thought that she kind of focus, like I think that it makes a lot of sense that she was writing this with I assume, I don't know specifically what year this was published, but with the background of like World War II like on her mind, because it focuses mostly on the degradation aspect and focuses mostly on people as objects, like things that are not living, as opposed to like inhuman things in general. So I thought that like I don't know, it's just kind of like I see what you mean about I'm not sure if this is exactly what you mean, but I see what you mean about like her kind of like missing the mark on the target of this essay, because like I'm like I love the writing and I love the idea that she's proposing, but I think it had like less to do with the Iliad than like the violence that she was seeing around her in her life. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, she's I'm not a Simone Weil scholar at all. She's writing this in 42, 43. She dies, if I remember, she dies in 43. It's not published until I think she publishes it in part as an article, if I'm remembering that correctly. But it's like most of her works, it's published after her death. But she's writing it, before, with hindsight, before what I think most people would say is the turning point of the war. And especially from a French point of view, she might have convictions on how it's going to end, but 41, 42, it's not looking. This is a hard time if you're French. Let's just put it that way. And also Jewish, even though she was secular Jew, she was never observant. That's that's there in the background. She has some kind of conversion, not to Catholicism, but to Christianity, and is in the last years of her life. And maybe this is what Scott's picking up on. In a way, this essay is not fully refined. And so in her later life, she's trying to work out how Christianity is so very different than the materialist philosophies that have motivated her. And she never comes to a resolution. She's got it. She's kind of pulling on those threads, and then she dies. And frankly, she dies of starvation. She starves herself to death because she's a zealot. I mean, she's an ideologue, and in the process of, I think, getting better, just doesn't make it. You know, her own life is a kind of illustration of, even when you're on the right path, life doesn't always offer a happy ending to everyone. Yeah, interesting figure, interesting moment in time. Classicists go back and forth on this as a piece of criticism. They increasingly are including it, and this is a valuable way to try to get a richer understanding of what the poet of the Iliad is attempting, even though it has flaws because she leaves things out. But she knew Greek, and she worked very hard on trying to come to an accurate interpretation of the Iliad. So she was not guilty of instrumentalizing Homer just for the sake of her own ideological vision. She was seeing what she believed to be human truths through this great work of literature. So, I mean, and I offered it so that we could kind of debate, but it's a cautionary note. It's a cautionary note. You can love the great books. It doesn't automatically make you right or wise. It may make you partially wise and put you on a journey. I'm sorry, someone jumped in. Was that Mr.
That was me. I was
Yeah, yeah.
yes. Yeah, I might be the only one who really likes the essay by Vale, because this is something I've been thinking about for months, particularly because I'm trying to go back to the mindset of a pagan. Like, how is it like to think about in a pre-Christian world? And last year I've been reading Girard, and then one thing is, aside from like the siding with the weak, is also like the killing of all the gods. When Christ came, all the old gods were killed, and then imagine like what's the how did the pagans see agency? Like, is it in like a human, but seeing war, and like I guess they had this animist understanding of the forces that influenced people. So I guess this is how I understand Veil. Like, it was the force that's actually the protagonist in how pagans saw society. So this is something I've been thinking about, and then she just expressed it. Yeah.
In the next 2 weeks, we'll get to deepen our understanding of how pagans look at these questions. And something to think about is we're not pagans, right? The last 1500 years of Western civilization has been largely Christian, or people heavily under the influence of Christianity. And yet, what we're looking at for this week, next week, the weekend, foundational texts, absolutely foundational texts to the way we think about war and violence. So it's intriguing to me to just pull back and wonder, the foundation of how we understand violence and warfare is so deeply rooted in a people who don't have a Christian understanding of anthropology, and a whole host of virtues, different understanding of vices. What does that mean? Because next week we move to Thucydides, and Thucydides is going to rhyme with Homer in his sobriety on power, how power is used. And then we'll take a look at what Tacitus has to say. And these texts, I think one of the reasons that Fahey wanted to take on the Iliad was she recognized there's certain texts that have a kind of momentum in our society. And she wanted to assess, I think, as she was going through her own journey deeper into Christianity, what does that mean? These narratives that we have, to help us guide us and understand us. And it's always worth weighing when you're reading the great books. Who's the author? What were the concerns of the author? And from a Christian point of view, does the author have many of the benefits that a Christian has? And that the answer to that is obvious. But the conclusion should be that we that much more appreciate the vision greatness of those who don't have the gift of revelation. And perhaps we're more critical on those who do and fail to live up to those gifts as well. So I'm not suggesting some sort of easy solution to these texts, but good to weigh where the authors are coming from. That was great. Thank you, Cahill.
Well, one question I would have, and this is something that I think we're gonna reoccur a lot on, is sides and who exactly is the author writing on. Homer, despite what we talked about at the beginning, where we said Hector's not the hero and Achilles is the hero, Homer doesn't necessarily say Hector is the worst kind of guy, or at the very least, like, he's not afraid to praise him. He calls him glorious Hector. And there's a lot of epithets he gives to people, and he's not, and like, he does show a lot of pitiable elements to them, like when they're mourning Hector, and the like. And Simone touches on this as well. So I don't think he necessarily has the sort of us versus them mentality, despite Homer being on the side of Achilles. He's his hero. This is about his culture against the Trojans. And I think this is something that we don't have today in a lot of modern contexts. I think there's post World War II, World War II onward, often conflicts have a very what's the word, eschatological idea, where it's these two sides are fighting against each other. One side is the ultimate evil that, if it's not defeated, will destroy us all, and the other side is the heroes who will destroy everything, who will keep everything preserved, and who have preserved everything. And it is interesting looking at history, like World War I. People did not see each other necessarily as the super, especially if you look at how a lot of people wrote about it at the time. There wasn't as much division over who were the good guys or who were the bad guys. There was only winners and losers. And so I think that there is some interesting thing when it comes to the historical context of it. But like when it comes to the Iliad, it's just looking at it from a modern person who is living through not only modernity and Christianity, those layers that he is not operating on, but just what he thinks of the both sides, and what, if we're supposed to take sides, because it feels like, at least to a person who's lived in the modern world, conflict across the globe, every battle requires you to take a side. And do we have to take a side with the Iliad? I don't think so, but that's something I think that a lot of people we'll have to talk about a lot when we talk about the Aeneid or other wars going forward.
Yeah, I don't think Homer calls on people to take sides in the way you're describing in the bottom. I mean, that's part of his majesty as a human. We haven't talked, and we don't really have that much time to talk about the poem in Chinese that you were given. But one of the things that I appreciate and enjoy are these moments where you have people who don't see things simply as sides. They may have sides that have significance, but Homer, I mean, I can't talk about the Homeric age. Homer, Homer, the Anglo-Saxon poets, and again, I'm not an expert in Oriental poetry, but many Chinese and some Japanese poems, when they reflect on war, they have this tragic sensibility that rises above the sides and looks to the humanity of both sides in a way, and the loss, and in some respects, the inevitable. All those societies have a sense of doom about them. Where are all the great warriors? The kind of instability of human glory over time in the face of violence, and it's not so much about taking sides. Certain parts of the Old Testament do that as well. But the psalm we read at the beginning of the class shows another part, right? Divinely inspired work doesn't abolish the human author or the human imagination. So I hope no one's scandalized if there are two different approaches to anything in Scripture when it's dealing with something human like war. But you can find some aspects like the 82nd Psalm where it's very clearly treat them like those other countries and just destroy them. And then there are other passages where there is still a conviction on who's on the right side, because that's crystal clear in Hebrew culture, and yet a recognition of the tragedy of war and death and the destruction of other people. So something for us to just continue to see how that idea plays out. Those ideas play out. Any last question? We've got maybe not quite 5 minutes, I think, but any final thoughts or questions before we sign off?
Yeah, I thought the essay did a great job at capturing the importance of humiliation at the end of book 22, where Achilles seems to enjoy despoiling the corpse of Hector. And I think if you compare that with, say, how when the Confederate surrendered in the Civil War, how the Union Army treated them, and in fact, when they were running out of supplies, of the days after the surrender, they actually gave them food. You can see this sort of the fascination in the pagan world with death and humiliation and what could become of a great man. So I think that's kind of like the essay helped me get into that kind of aspect of pagan mentality.
Be on the lookout when 2 weeks from now, when we're looking at the Romans and we're in Tacitus, how Tacitus handles exactly what you said, how he assesses who's the enemy, what are the sides. It gets really complex and interesting from that point of view. So speaking of the coming weeks, as I said, for the Iliad, I was using the Fagel's translation. I will occasionally supply you something that I think you probably don't have access to this text, or let's just all have the same text. But for the most part, I'm just going to specify the author work by the title and give you the normal way to find a passage or a book or a section. I don't care for our purposes on which translation you use. We're not doing close readings for the most part. We're dealing for the most part with texts that are not in our own language. And so there's something interesting if we have more than one translation in the room to see, oh gosh, that person we're looking at the exact same passage and there's a slight shading there that I wouldn't have gotten. And it may be because we're operating at least a step removed with the language. So use whatever translations you're comfortable with, you have access to in the coming weeks. And I'm going to supply for some of the shorter readings something that's common to all, but otherwise I'm not going to get hung up on which edition. All right, next week we have Thucydides and some selections from his great history of the Peloponnesian War. If what I might do is I might throw in perhaps the first page of Herodotus, just so we can talk about the father of history, as he's sometimes called, and see how he sets up massive conflict before we jump in with Thucydides. If you haven't read Thucydides, and you're inclined towards things philosophic, I think you will really like what you find in Thucydides. I hope all of you appreciate him. So very nice to be with everyone, and I will see you in a week's time. Please send me an email if there are any things to clarify or if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.